Chapter 63. AN, please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps my motivation to continue writing this story. Chapter 63. Peter, hey Harry. Just checking in to see if you flew back to New York safely. I heard what happened and I can't believe you were attacked by killer drones. That's so fucked up, man. I hope you're okay. Call or text me anytime. Sent, July 28, 2023, 7:04 a.m. Peter, hi Harry. I haven't heard back from you and I'm starting to get worried. Do I need to start financing to hire a PI? Sent, July 29, 2023, 11:24 p.m. Peter, I would come over but I'm not sure where you live now. Was your house rebuilt? Sent, July 30, 2023, 9:14 a.m. Peter, I just tried calling you and it only rang twice. I know you sent me to voicemail. Why aren't you picking up? Did I do something wrong? Sent, July 30, 2023, 7:31 p.m. Peter, if I did, then I'm sorry. Sent, July 30, 2023, 7:44 p.m. Peter, I'm going to fight for our friendship, you know. I won't stop until we get to the bottom of this. Sent, July 30, 2023, 7:46 p.m. Peter, was it because I didn't go to London with you guys? I thought you understood why I couldn't. Sent, July 30, 2023, 7:49 p.m. Peter, I tried calling you again and it only rang once. Just please tell me what's going on, Har. Sent, July 30, 2023, 7:56 p.m. Peter, how am I supposed to know what I did wrong if you don't talk to me? Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:01 p.m. Harry, stop texting and calling, Peter. Just leave me alone. I need some time to myself. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:04 p.m. Peter, glad to know that you're alive. Care to tell me what's wrong? Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:05 p.m. Harry, you really want to know? I'm surprised that MJ hasn't told you. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:13 p.m. Peter, MJ? What's she got to do with this? And she's been busy trying to put her life back together like I have been with my own. And you know what she's been through. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:14 p.m. Peter, and yes, I want to know. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:14 p.m. Harry, I still need a bit of time to myself. But I'll text you my address when I'm ready to talk. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:26 p.m. Peter, Harry, this is ridiculous. Talk to me now. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:27 p.m. Harry, I don't think that I can. And until then, I'm going to block your number, Pete. I'm sorry. Sent, July 30, 2023, 8:49 p.m. Recoiling away from his screen, Peter tried to rapidly blink away the hurt that he felt at Harry's outright rejection toward any sort of discourse. But below the hurt was the underlying confusion that interwove itself throughout all aspects of this bizarre situation. Dressed in his red and black spider suit, he was currently perched on top of a ledge on a random building in Queens. About to go out hunting for crime out in the city. But he had gotten distracted when Harry had finally responded to his texts and calls. Why was Harry acting like this? He was usually so laid back and cool about everything. He's never acted like this before. At least, not toward Peter. For the life of him, Peter honestly couldn't think of a single thing he had said or done that would set Harry off like this. He was honestly baffled at the abrupt change in his friend that Peter felt a sensation akin to whiplash. What made it worse was that Harry wouldn't even begin to tell him what was wrong. But then again, in the short amount of responses Peter had managed to get from his friend, Harry had given Peter a clue. I'm surprised that MJ hasn't told you. Frowning, Peter couldn't help scratching his head at what Mary Jane supposedly knew about this situation that he didn't. What exactly went down in London during Peter's absence? Well, there was only one way to find out. Pocketing his phone, Peter leapt from the ledge before shooting off a web that latched itself to a nearby building, one destination in mind. And it only took him several minutes to get there. When he landed on the fire escape attached to her building, he rapped on her window, and only had to wait a few seconds before her curtains parted and her beautiful face was there. Mary Jane's lips split into a wide, delighted grin at seeing him there on the other side, and Peter couldn't help melting at the sight of it, again reminding him that she was the sunshine of his life, making his world brighter by casting away the dark clouds. This was made even more apparent in the fact that they hadn't yet seen each other today. And the time apart suddenly made itself known in its palpable transparency. Immediately, she unlatched the lock on the window, opened it and grabbed his arms to tug him inside. Peter allowed her to guide him into the apartment as he steadied himself on his 2 feet in her bedroom. Before Peter could even get a word out, she reached for the hem of his mask and tugged it upward, revealing his mouth just a second before she pressed her lips hungrily to his. "MPHHH." Peter sputtered in surprise at the pleasant attack, but, after half a second of deliberation, he realized that he shouldn't have been all that surprised. Mary Jane had a history of launching random kisses at him when he least expected it. And rather than wasting time contemplating it, he should instead be reaping the full benefits. At least to give him a few moments where he could get his mind off of Harry and his bizarre behavior. Winding his arms around her slender waist, taking note of the frilly blue blouse she wore and how nice it looked on her, he constricted them and tugged her closer, opening his mouth as he pressed his tongue against the seam of her lips. With a breathy sigh, she parted those pillowy lips to him readily. So pliant and ready for him to reach past. Fuck yes. The way that she opened up to him was something akin to the satisfaction of a magician crying "Open Sesame." And actually having the command heeded. That's right. He felt like a motherfucking wizard. Doctor Strange has got nothing on him at the moment, not while Peter was kissing his most amazing girl in the world, a girl who could cause the sensation of his head floating away in the clouds with every stroke of her mouth against his. Pushing past her lips, they both let out soft groans when the tips of their tongues touched. Her mouth tasted like a mix of spearmint and chai latte, and he absent-mindedly wondered if she went to the coffee shop she liked so much down the street, the one she showed him just the other day, Brewhouse Coffee. But that thought was shoved completely out of his mind as the deliciously soft muscle in her mouth began swirling and twisting around his own. Peter shivered at the resulting tingles this created. He could feel it all the way down to his toes, which automatically curled in his spider boots. Inside his suit, his dick began to react with her every touch, steadily growing until he was at full mast and straining uncomfortably against the tight fabric. The erotic dance continued as Mary Jane's hands began to explore his arms, his chest, only covered modestly by his skin-tight spider suit. Peter, in turn, released one hand from her waist and brought it up to weave through her soft waves of hair, tangling it within his fingers as he held her head steady, pushing his tongue in further as it battled for dominance against her own. This continued in the same manner for what felt like hours, but in actuality, it was so much shorter than that. Finally, they broke away for air, sucking in the same, shared oxygen with their lips still brushing even as they stood there, panting. "I'm gonna leave the window unlocked from now on," Mary Jane rasped in such a low voice that it had Peter groaning, not only from how seductive her voice sounded, but the meaning behind her words. It was an open invitation for him to come and go out of her bedroom as he pleased. "You definitely won't find me complaining," he murmured as his lips pressed gently against hers again, "especially if you greet me like that every time I crawl through." Emitting a low chuckle, Mary Jane began to trace her finger up and down his chest accompanied with a sound that Peter could only describe as a sensual purr. "What can I say? I was pleasantly surprised to see you. I couldn't help myself." That got her a nip in the bottom lip as he snatched it up between his teeth. She squeaked as he rolled the soft skin gently before releasing her. "It's dangerous for you to say things like that and not expect consequences, Miss Watson." Taking liberties against his obvious warning, she pressed herself closer, their chests touching, which had Peter hyper-fixated on the swell of her breasts against him. "What if I like the consequences?" Inside his mouth, he had to actively bite his tongue to keep in his moan, and it took a moment before he was able to steady himself. "Then by all means, continue getting yourself into trouble. I don't mind." She grinned up at him, before her hand came up and pushed his spider mask off the rest of the way, revealing his face as well as his wild, loose waves of brunette hair. "There you are. Hello, brown eyes." Peter couldn't help but visibly soften in response at the action and her words. To think he had once thought that Mary Jane preferred the mask over Peter. Well, that obviously wasn't the case. Not when he was judging by the current imploring, gentle look in her eyes as her hand came up to cup his cheek, her thumb tracing along the apple of it underneath his eye. "Not that I'm complaining, but what are you doing here? I thought you said that you'd be out trying to track Lincoln right about now?" It was still a guilty shame that Peter felt when he had to come to Mary Jane's apartment 2 days earlier and admitted to her that he had no idea where Lincoln was. Especially when he saw a flash of anxiety cross her features at the knowledge that her kidnapper was still out there, free, though she had tried to hide her natural reaction from him. Peter had chosen not to comment, knowing that she didn't want attention drawn to it. Instead, he vowed to her that he would do everything within his power to put Lincoln behind bars. And perhaps, as he thought of it, keeping the window unlocked was a bad idea. As much as he loved the idea of having free access to her bedroom, he would much rather knock if it meant that she kept that extra layer of protection. I was just about to begin my patrol, but I got distracted, Peter admitted, reminding himself as to the reason why he was here. Distracted? Mary Jane asked as her hand on his cheek went up to play with his hair, brushing away some strands that fell on his forehead. By what? Harry. A perfectly manicured brow arched on her forehead as it matched with a frown that marred her lips, but she didn't say anything, so Peter took that as an invitation to continue. He has been dodging my texts and calls for days now. It's become pretty clear that he's ticked off at me for something. But I can't for the life of me think of what I've done, Peter blurted out, a melting pot of anxiety and frustration boiling out of him. His left gloved hand came up and knotted in his hair, pulling at the roots. As he spoke, Mary Jane's expression fell into a serious glower, her eyes contemplative while she bit her bottom lip. But there was also a light in her eyes that bespoke of understanding. He finally texted me back to say that he needs time alone, Peter finished, looking down at her curiously, but he still won't tell me what's going on. Instead, he mentioned that he was surprised that you hadn't mentioned it yet. Still biting her lip, Mary Jane worried it between her teeth, uncertain, I should have. Peter couldn't help but frown at her. Why didn't you? They had promised no more secrets. Releasing a heavy sigh, Mary Jane dropped her hand from the side of his face and instead placed it flat over his heart. Because I didn't think that Harry would still be holding on to this. I thought that after all the chaos that happened in London, he would let go of his petty jealousy. Both of Peter's brows shot up. Jealousy? Mary Jane nodded. Of who? Of you, silly, Mary Jane said with an eye roll and a snort. What? Blinking rapidly, Peter's eyes crinkled as he tried to make sense of it all, but why? What in the hell would Harry Osborn have to be jealous of when it comes to me? Huffing, Mary Jane crossed her arms over her chest. I mean, you've got plenty going for you. I'm being serious, Peter said, his voice edging on complaint. So am I. Scoffing, now it was Peter's turn to roll his eyes. Then you're being biased. Not really. Mary Jane countered with a nonchalant shrug. I told you before, do you really think I would settle for less than my standards? Despite himself, and the fact that his tongue was in her mouth mere moments ago, he found himself blushing. Okay. He conceded to that point, because she had told him as much before. That still doesn't answer my question of what exactly he's jealous of? It just didn't make any sense. Harry was popular. Harry was rich. Harry was good-looking. Peter, he was none of those things. At least, perhaps he was conventionally attractive. In a way. But nowhere near Harry's movie star looks. Mary Jane sighed, actually looking quite annoyed. It's just so silly that he's taking it out on you. It really is completely out of your control. What is? Taking the time to mull over her words in her head before she spoke them, Mary Jane finally said carefully, when we all thought that we were about to die from the drone attack, we all sorta made some last confessions. Peter's eyes widened, shocked to hear that she and the others had genuinely thought that they had been that close to death. It made his heart break to think that Mary Jane had been put into such a position, terrified out of her mind and thinking that he wouldn't make it in time to save her. Mary Jane. Peter breathed, his voice coming out broken, but Mary Jane ignored it and pushed past it with a shake of her head. Harry's confession. She broke off with a sigh before she trudged forward, had been that he had overheard Michelle and I talking on the plane ride to London. About Michelle's crush on you. Standing there, staring at her, Peter waited for her to finish her statement. But she didn't. Instead she was looking up at him expectantly, as though waiting for some sort of response from him. Frowning, Peter prodded, on who? Mary Jane released a cute, perplexed sort of sound. You, Peter. He continued to stare at her, his brows knitted, not quite comprehending as he worked it through in his mind. What she said didn't make a lick of sense. But as her words finally settled in his brain, "I'm sorry." What? Had the world gone mad when he decided to go to Berlin? Was the water poison in London that caused for whoever drank it to delve into impossible delusions? Because there was no way, that Michelle Jones liked Peter Parker. It was complete and utter lunacy. Eyeing him carefully, Mary Jane couldn't seem to help herself from asking, "You really didn't know?" "PSHH? Are you kidding?" Peter broke away from her and began to pace the expanse of the bedroom before her. "That's just about as believable to me than someone telling me that it's a scientific fact that if you fall, then gravity makes you float toward the sky." Why couldn't his life just be simple for once? For the first time in his life since Uncle Ben died, he was well and truly happy. He defeated Mysterio, became the hero that he, Mr. Stark, believed he could be in his absence, and finally had the girl that he loved as his girlfriend. Life was supposed to be bliss. But his friends couldn't get on the same wavelength with him. Instead, they had to stir up all this drama. Despite himself, he found himself well and truly ticked, if he were being honest. "Well, it's true," Mary Jane continued as her eyes watched his progress as he paced. "She and I talked about it on the plane after I noticed her checking you out." This halted Peter in his tracks as he turned on his heel on a dime. "She what?" Stepping forward with a sigh, Mary Jane grasped both of his hands in hers. "Focus, Tiger." Forcing in a breath so that it reached all the way to the bottom of his lungs, Peter released it, accompanied with a staggered nod of his head at her. He needed to calm down. He was getting all worked up before he even had all the facts. "Right, sorry." Then, suddenly, her words from before seemed to finally catch up to him. "Wait. So, if Harry overheard you guys talking about this, then he got bitter about it, Peter," Mary Jane finished for him with a roll of her eyes, seeming annoyed by the whole situation too. Well, at least he had the comfort in knowing that Mary Jane was on his side, and not the one who was upset with him rather than Harry. He didn't know what he would have done if Mary Jane was the one dodging his calls and texts in the same manner that Harry was, but what he did know is that it would have driven him crazy. He sorta holds a grudge against you now. Because the Michelle thing was apparently the thing that crossed the line for him. It wasn't just her words, but her tone of voice that belied so much more underneath the surface. And Peter caught on immediately. "You mean there's more?" He couldn't help but gape at her, wondering what else there was that he could have done to offend Harry. A slightly embarrassed expression clouded her beautiful features, her hand tightening subconsciously around his spider mask that she still held clutched in her hand. Automatically, Peter stepped closer, sensing her discomfort as he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder in a way of support. He didn't want her to think that he would angry at her. Far from it. He was just exasperated by the situation at hand. Mary Jane's hand came up as she placed it over his on her shoulder, her gaze wandered up to his, and that was when she finally took the plunge. "He said that he lost me to you." With this bombshell of a revelation, Peter's eyes widened in shock. "But he was always so cool about the fact that I liked you first." Not that he had called dibs on Mary Jane or anything, but it was sort of silently implied when they talked about it during their guys' night. Regardless, it was baffling to Peter considering that it was Harry that had been the one to call him out on being an idiot for not making a move on her. Had that been false bravado on Harry's part? Was he pretending not to care when, in actuality, he did? What was it that Harry had said that night when Peter questioned him about it? He reassured Peter by telling him that he was rich and handsome, so he would have no trouble finding someone else. But in reality, Harry did have trouble getting the next girl he had wanted. Because Michelle apparently had no interest in him. But instead had her eye on Peter. "Yeah, well." Mary Jane spoke up, shaking Peter out of his reverie. "Can't say that I was too pleased when I heard that part of it. He's acting like a douchebag and thinking that he could have just won me over like some sort of trophy." When she put it that way, Peter couldn't help but wince. It does take your personal choice out of the equation, doesn't it? He was now thoroughly ashamed in playing a part on the whole dibs thing with Harry. What if Harry had met her first and called dibs himself, but then Mary Jane had no interest in him? It was actually a backwards way of thinking of things. Jaw tensed, Mary Jane nodded stiffly. "It wouldn't have even mattered if I met him first over you. I still would have chosen you, Peter." A blossoming sensation sprouted in his chest, making his heart feel so full. He loved her so much. He really didn't deserve her sometimes. Sighing, Mary Jane ran a hand through her hair before saying, "Regardless, some part of him believes that you stole me right out from under his nose. But not just me, but also Michelle. And his father." "What?" Peter blinked, soaking in yet another unexpected tidbit of information on his supposed transgressions against Harry, Mr. Osborne. "Don't tell me that he has a crush on me too, because I swear." "No." Mary Jane interrupted, a slight smirk appearing on her lips despite herself. "Nothing like that. Apparently, you got Mr. Osborne's respect when Harry didn't." "But..." Peter trailed off, not really knowing what to say. It was true that Norman Osborne had a weird fascination with Peter every time that they crossed paths. But Peter never saw it as something he should pride himself in. He more found it creepy. Every time he was in Mr. Osborne's presence, an uneasy sensation would always settle down in the pit of his stomach. Peter would have much more preferred if Norman Osborne didn't pay attention to him now. "I know," Mary Jane nodded at him, as though she could somehow read his thoughts. "That's why I thought he'd be over it by now. Harry's reasons are too petty. You can't help it if people like you, Peter. You're just that charming." Absent-mindedly, Peter shook his head. "No. Jealousy that's been buried for this long doesn't just go away in a matter of days. I only wish that he had talked to me about all of this. It probably would have made him feel better about it all." Hesitating, Mary Jane countered, "To be fair, I think that Harry struggles with opening up. I mean, you've seen the relationship he's had with his father. Can you imagine growing up with that man as your dad and somehow come out on the other end as an open book?" Peter sighed, knowing that she was right. He had often marveled at the fact that Harry somehow ended up as normal when he had such a hard ass as a father like Norman. Perhaps it just took longer for Harry to show Peter some of the negative effects of having such parentage. "So what do you suggest I do?" Peter asked, at a loss for how to even fix any of this. This was so completely out of the realm of his capabilities. He knew that he was sort of clueless when it came to picking up on other people's body language and cues. Mary Jane herself had teased him for missing all of the apparent signals that she had been sending him before they had started dating. So this situation with Harry seemed near to impossible for him to fix. Compassion for him softened the hardness in her gaze, knowing how difficult this was for him. "There's nothing you really can do until he's willing to talk to you." Peter made a face. That was easier said than done when his best friend had literally blocked his number. What if Harry decided to never reach out? What then? "I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's all you can do," Mary Jane said as brought a comforting hand up to his cheek again before she leaned forward and kissed the tip of his nose. "But hey, at least you understand now why he's upset, right? It's no longer shrouded in mystery." Peter sighed and shrugged one shoulder. "I guess." Then, another thought crossed his mind as he ducked his head and pressed his forehead against hers, both their eyes crossing slightly as they connected. "You do know that there's nothing for you to worry about when it comes to Michelle, right?" She smiled softly at him as her arms came up to wrap languidly around his neck. "I know. I think even she knows that. I mean, she would always call me names," Peter added to his reassurance to her, wanting her to really understand things from his perspective here. She was trying the old pigtail pulling on the playground tactic, it seemed. Did it work? Her lips tugged upward into an unmitigated smirk. "Were you properly seduced?" Peter snorted and shoved at her shoulder lightly, playfully, as he pretended to be offended enough to take a deliberate step back from her. "Stop it." Mary Jane just simply giggled at him and followed him, wrapping her arms around his waist as they both chuckled lightly. She was so good at distractions. Then, finally sobering, Peter sighed. "Will I have to have a conversation with Michelle now? I mean, she does know my secret now. I can't just ignore her." Reflecting on this for a moment, Mary Jane seemed to come to a conclusion as she nodded. "It couldn't hurt. But I think that she really is trying to move on. And she's started to grow on me, actually." Peter's brows arched upward. "What?" One corner of her lips lifting, Mary Jane shrugged one shoulder nonchalantly. "Yeah, I could see us being friends." This actually pleased Peter beyond belief. She needed more friends in her life. It wouldn't be fair to her if he expected her to give away all of her free time to Peter to monopolize. And He would be lying if he didn't admit that it made him feel better in knowing that this new friend was also a girl rather than another guy like Harry. Well, at least one good thing came out from all of this, Peter said as he pressed his lips to her forehead. Thanks for talking with me. I needed to know what was going on with Harry before I could focus on fighting tonight. You're leaving now, I'm assuming? Mary Jane asked, the slightest of pouts on her features that she was trying to hide. Peter nodded. It's starting to get late. The lowlives will begin to creep out of their mother's basement soon. Mary Jane snickered just as Peter pulled away from her embrace. He reached forward and grabbed his spider mask from her hand and slid it back on over his head, preparing to leave. It was only when he took a few steps toward the window, when he suddenly remembered something and turned back to look at her. Oh, and another thing, can you please keep your window locked? I don't want just anyone in New York to have access into your apartment simply for my own convenience's sake. I'll continue to knock. That's a good point. She conceded as she stepped forward and placed a chaste kiss on his masked cheek. Go get him, tiger. He didn't make it very far. Instead of swinging off into the night, Peter instead rounded the corner of the building, ensuring that he was out of sight of Mary Jane's window, before he changed trajectory and instead latched himself onto the exterior wall of his old apartment. Crawling, he swiftly made it to the rooftop where he climbed over the ledge. Panting slightly, Peter rapidly made his way over toward the door that led to the stairs inside and hid in the shadows behind the wall. He struggled with his spider suit, wishing that he had worn the iron spider suit so that he could have utilized the nanotechnology and freed his straining cock that much sooner. It was with a sigh of relief when his hardness finally bobbed free of his spider pants, the cool night air contradicting the heat pulsating through his veins. The impromptu makeout session had really affected him. And he couldn't go out fighting in this condition. Not that he would trade kissing Mary Jane for anything in the world. But by God, he was just so horny these days without any promise of relief. He was going to rectify that now, quickly. Using his teeth, he pulled at the fingers of his spider gloves, freeing his hands of the fabric. Then, he spit into his palm, intending to use it for lubricant. Okay, he said, steadying himself. He couldn't believe that he was doing this here, now. But he really had no other options. A detour home would take too much time. It was now peak hour for crime. Wrapping his hands around his member, he began to stroke, immediately enjoying the pleasurable zap that shot down his length and through his balls. He sighed in satisfaction at the touch as he stumbled back a step until his back pressed against the brick wall. Automatically, his eyes closed as he let the fantasies wash over him. Mary Jane. He breathed, envisioning her luscious red hair, curled and tangled in knots from his hands having run through it. In his mind's eye, he was still downstairs with her. And instead of having to go off to fight crime, Peter was instead invited to stay, which he eagerly accepted. They would continue to make out, the passion of their kiss building to new heights with each passing second. Until the need for air couldn't be ignored, and they would break away, panting deeply to try and fill their lungs. The look that she would give him then would be hot, heavy. The green of her irises smoldering to a dark forest green as she eyed him with lust. Then, reaching down to the hem of her blue blouse, she would lift the fabric over her head, revealing a lack of bra as she bared her chest to him for the first time. You look so beautiful, he would tell her as his hand would reach out to palm her breast without hesitation. With the next swipe upward of his fist on his member, Peter gathered some of the precum with his thumb, adding it to his slick fist as he continued to fuck into it, his hips thrusted upward into a rapid speed. Low groans escaped from deep within his chest at the sensations of the crude action of his fist. He lost all awareness of his surroundings. In his mind, all he saw was Mary Jane. Dipping forward, he would then latch onto her nipple with his mouth watering as he got his first taste of her. She would moan, arching her back and pressing her chest forward further into his mouth as his tongue would circle and flick around the sensual point. Switching over the other, he would give it the same treatment, knowing that he was a firm believer in equality. Only when she was left gasping and withering from where she stood, would she suddenly grip his shoulders and gently push him away. A noise of complaint would be at just the tip of his tongue, but it was stopped by the heady look in his direction, so seductive by the low fire burning within her irises. Left panting, he could only stare as he was held captive by that gaze, unable to even utter a single word. That is, until she slowly began sinking down to her knees before him. A longer groan escaped him as his hips snapped faster into his strong, tight fist. Holy fuck. He would breathe in awe at the vision of her on her knees at his feet. One corner of her lips would lift up into a confident smirk as her hands came up and quickly worked at removing his length from his spider suit, much more efficiently than could be done in real life. He was getting close. He could feel it in the tightening of his balls. Dragging her tongue up from his base to the tip, she took his length into her hand before she would enclose her mouth around the head. He would marvel at the vision of how beautifully seductive she would look with his cock in her mouth. A primal, male-dominated part of his brain even whispered that perhaps it even belonged there, in her mouth. Cheeks caving inward, she would then begin to bob her head, taking more of him into the warm and wet cavern of her mouth, sliding the underside of it against her wiggling tongue. It was easy for him to imagine that his fist was actually Mary Jane's mouth, not yet knowing the difference between what a blowjob and masturbation felt like. Her free hand would then come up to cup his balls, her fingers rolling them gently and only adding to his overall pleasure. Bobbing back up his length, she would then lick at his slit, before whispering against it, "I want you to come in my mouth, tiger." That was what did it. The low rasp of her provocative voice combined with the words and the image in his head, caused his balls to draw upward as he erupted his climax. A longer groan escaped him, lost to the picture in his head, but still, he managed to be in the right enough state of mind to point the head of his cock away from him and toward the ground, painting the concrete with his seed. Chest heaving as his orgasm came to an end, his legs no longer felt like they had the strength to keep him upright, so he slid down the wall until he was seated on the ground, needing a moment to catch his breath. Fuck, that was intense. He didn't think that he's ever had an orgasm quite that powerful before. He must have been more worked up than he previously thought. Okay. No more blue balling it, Parker, he ordered himself with a heaving breath. You need to learn the art of a little self-care. He sat there for several more minutes, allowing his heartbeat to slow down, before he tucked himself back into his spider suit and donned his gloves, feeling rejuvenated enough now to go out and kick some ass. For several blocks now, he was stalking the group of thugs. He caught the tail end of their crime spree from a family-owned jewelry store. And judging by the copious amount of bags that they looted, it would ruin the business, and the family, to a degree that not even insurance would help it to recover the lost goods. It was with that knowledge in mind that Peter knew he would take absolute glee in humiliating these burly men when he finally got around to beating them to a pulp. But he didn't want to make the jump on them yet. No, he wanted to see where they would lead him first. It was a high hope of his that they would go to a headquarters of some sort, to turn in majority of the shares of stolen goods to the crime boss that they worked for. But that ended up not being the case, unfortunately. Instead, they pulled in their white van so that it was hidden in the shadows of a dark alleyway in Brooklyn, this part of the neighborhood littered with trash and dirt along with flickering street lamps. Peter watched from a nearby rooftop as they all piled out of the van, each looking around in a circle to see if they had been followed. There were only 4 of them. This would be a piece of cake. Go. The ski masks were a bit cliched. At least the guys that he fought at the ATM store had a touch of originality, wearing Avengers masks instead of following stereotypes. Do you think we were followed? The tallest of the bunch asked the others. There was an edge of authority to his voice, obviously the leader to this ragtag group of thugs. Nah, the largest man, stout and portly in stature, spoke up with a laid-back wave of his hand. The police didn't even have the chance to pick up on our spree. We disabled their cheap alarm system before even entering the store. The man broke off with a laugh as Peter frowned, making a mental note to take a look at the store's alarm system later on, perhaps recalibrate it with an upgrade. It's not the cops I'm worried about. The leader said, nervous as his eyes did a sweep of the rooftops, ironically in every place except for the shadow that Peter was hiding within. Spider-Man's been spotted back swinging through the city. Don't remind me, the shortest of the lot chimed in, his voice dripping with annoyance. My kid brother has been over the moon, ranting and raving about the web-headed freak. Peter smiled at this from underneath his mask. It was nice knowing he had a fan. Watching from his vantage point as they each began to grab a bag, opening them up and bending over them as they inspected their big score, Peter deemed it the perfect opportunity to sneak down the wall. Get a load of this, Ruby. The 4th and final man spoke up excitedly before he doubled his efforts in enthusiastically sorting through the piles of jewels. Once Peter's feet were firmly on the ground, he casually walked up behind the group and just stood there, watching them. None of them had even noticed that he was there, too invested by their own greed to know that they were fucked. Has any one of you ever seen Spider-Man in real life? The fourth criminal spoke up. His voice sounded nervous as it came out in a bit of a stutter. Good. He should be afraid of Spider-Man. Nope, the leader spoke up with a shake of his head. Not me, the portly man snickered, obviously detecting the nerves from the one who asked the question in the first place. Me neither, the shortest one said with a scoff. The tone of his voice indicated his belief that seeing Spider-Man was not all that big of a deal. After tonight, that perception would change. Nope. Can't say that I have, Peter said from behind them all, his voice highly amused. Good, the nervous man's shoulders sagged in relief with this confirmation from his crewmates. That means that we aren't on his radar. It took all his effort for Peter to hold in his laughter and give himself away. They just made it too easy to make themselves look stupid that Peter's job of humiliating them was already half finished. Squaring his shoulders, Peter prepared himself for his big reveal. But, what if he has this power of being able to detect and track down the biggest group of fucking idiots in the city? Peter asked, his voice dramatically laced with fear as he made a show of trembling in his boots. What are you going on, Apo? The leader turned his head back, finally spotting Spider-Man in all his glory right behind them. This is the part where you peacefully surrender, Peter suggested helpfully. It's him. The leader cried as they all scrambled upright, dropping their looted bags as the leader took out his gun and pointed it at Peter. Spider sense tingling, Peter dodged out of the way just as a cosmic blast shot out in the spot where Peter had just been standing. Great. Even after 6 years of the Vulture being behind bars, the Chitauri weapons that Toombs had distributed for years were still out there. Honestly. Why did he have a habit of going after girls whose dads had an affinity for villainy? Sure, Mark turned over a new leaf, but last Peter's heard of the Vulture, he broke out of prison before readmitting himself. It was also bizarre. The others were still playing catch-up and were slower to draw their own weapons, which gave Peter the perfect opportunity of webbing them out of their hands before they even had the chance to aim. The leader pointed and shot again, just a second before Peter leapt up in a flip and landed on the nearby alleyway wall. How did you find us here? The fourth goon cried out, already in a fit of panic and Peter's yet to touch him. How is it that you always seem to know where to go? It's like I have ESPN or something, Peter jibed back, just as the cosmic energy zapped out, striking the wall and blowing a hole through it right after Peter had vacated the spot with a flip. While midair, Peter used his webs and glued the Chitauri gun to the leader's hands with so much web fluid goo that he wasn't even able to pull the trigger. Landing on his feet behind them, the leader grunted in frustration as he tried to maneuver his hands into position so that he could utilize the weapon. Peter couldn't help snickering at him. Problem with your blasting gun there, buckaroo? Don't worry, I heard that they have pills for that now. Without their weapons, they had nothing to defend themselves with except for their fists. 3 of them charged at Peter swinging, while the fourth one began running away down the other end of the alleyway in fear. Outright laughing in absolute glee, Peter could honestly say that he was having a blast as he effortlessly disposed of all 3 gangsters one by one, knocking them out with so much ease that it was actually quite pitiful. None of them had been even able to touch him. The amount of shame they would feel in themselves in the morning stroked at the newly found pride that he had in his chest. It felt good to easily win at something for once. With all 3 of them unconscious at his feet, Peter looked up to see the other man nearly at the opening of the alleyway, attempting his escape. Honestly, out of all 4 of them, this man was probably the smartest for attempting to run away rather than taking a crack at fighting him. But still, his efforts would be all for nothing in the end because with one giant leap, Peter was upon him, and with a flourish of a flip in the air, a giant stream of webbing shot out at the man, jerking him to the side as it forcibly collided his body to the brick wall of the alleyway, trapping him there in his web. Ugh! The man cried out in surprise at the unexpected action that led to his temporary imprisonment. Peter landed nimbly on his feet, taking a moment to stretch his arms out in front of him as he loosened his muscles at the brief amount of exercise. All of this felt really good, exerting this energy. Then, in a show of complete slowness, Peter turned and began to stalk toward his prey. Ah! Good, Peter mused as he drew ever closer, his voice dripping with what he presumed to be ravenous hunger. Now that I caught one of you in my web, it's time for this spider to eat. What do you mean? The man's saucer-like eyes widened possibly further as Peter drew in close, and pretended to sniff at the man as though he were the most appetizing New York strip steak and Peter was a man dying of starvation. Peter chuckled darkly as he drew away, his eye lenses narrowed into dangerous slits. I'm part arachnid. You didn't know that? That means that I have particular spider tastes. Human flesh is the closest to flies I could find, actually. No. The gangster, who had been previously frozen in fear as he suddenly began to kick and squirm against his bonds, unsuccessful in breaking free of them, Get away from me, you freak. Pretending to consider him, Peter crossed one arm over his chest while the other came up to stroke at his chin as he took the time to ponder. I suppose we can make a deal if you talk. I'll talk. The withering man begged, practically at the point of blubbering. Peter almost wondered if he pissed his pants at this point. Good. You better hurry, too, Peter said as his arm crossed the space between them and ran along the trembling man's masked jaw. My stomach is starting to rumble. The goon flinched away from Peter's touch with a pitiful whimper. Good. Peter had him right where he wanted him. Where's Lincoln? He demanded with an edge of hardness to his voice, bridging for no sign of subterfuge. Through the ski mask's eye holes, the gangster blinked rapidly. Who? Sorry, Tombstone, Peter corrected, realizing his error. Of course the low-level goons wouldn't know the true identity of the infamous crime boss they worked for. There were probably few within the organization who actually did, and Peter knew that Hammerhead was one of the not-so-fortunate ones who had that level of access. Tombstone? The blubbering man gasped out before wildly shaking his head. We're not Tombstone's men. We belong to the Kingpin. Gritting his teeth, Peter nearly released a growl of resentment. It wasn't the crime boss that he was specifically looking for, but he wasn't about to turn away any information in locating Kingpin, either. Then care to tell me where I can find the Kingpin? Peter managed to get out in a terse voice. He was disappointed in the knowledge that he was still nowhere near finding out what rock Lincoln was hiding under, like the cockroach he was. Yeah, you think I'm important enough to even speak to the guy? The man stuttered as he shifted uneasily within his webbed prison, let alone know where he is. It was easy for Peter to tell. The man was telling the truth. He was too scared shitless to do anything otherwise. With a frustrated grunt, Peter reared his arm back and elbowed him in the head, knocking him unconscious with a single blow as he slumped against the wall, his head falling forward to his chest. Letting out an anguished cry of bitter concept, Peter punched the wall next to the man's head with all his might, leaving an impressive hole in the wall while puffing out a cloud of dust from the action. Where are you, Lincoln? Peter cried out toward the sky, furious that the man who knew about Mary Jane's existence was still out there. Free. Huffing, Peter forced himself into a level of calm. Throwing a tantrum was not going to help matters. But still, it was difficult not to feel old insecurities suddenly wanting to come creeping back in, whispering words of discouragement about his continuous failures. He forcibly shut them out, knowing how much such thoughts had nearly gotten not only himself, but Mary Jane, his friends, and half of London killed. Taking in another deep breath, Peter closed his eyes, counting to 10. Then opened them and looked around at the 4 unconscious criminals and the bags of stolen jewels that needed to be returned. Well, tonight was a bust. At least. When it came to his search, there was a family that would wake up tomorrow with the knowledge that their livelihood had been saved. And that was something that also mattered. Swinging home, unable to completely shake the feeling of defeat panging in his chest, Peter mulled over the events of the night. He had returned the stolen jewels to the store and found that the criminal had been right when he had boasted about the alarm system not even tripping. The police hadn't even arrived on the scene, not having been alerted. So, Peter entered without any trouble and set the bags of jewels on the glass countertop with a note that said, "Courtesy of your friendly neighborhood, Spider-Man." But before leaving, he took a look at the alarm that they had, recalibrating it just as he promised himself earlier. He had to leave to go pick up new parts to help upgrade their system, but that hadn't taken too long. And when he returned, everything was right where he had left it. It took under an hour for the upgrade, and Peter made sure to write a note on instructions for the family on how to set a new disabling code for the alarm. It was nearly 2 in the morning by the time he swung out of there and decided to call it a night, feeling the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to him. As soon as he got home, he stripped out of his spider suit, standing in his boxers as his mind continued down a line of bustling thoughts. He was downright exhausted. But he also felt that he couldn't sleep either. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted his suitcase sitting up against his bedroom wall, still unpacked from his trip to Europe. Shoulders slumping, he sighed. He might as well unpack it now and do something productive as his brain went over ideas of what to do. It was obvious that just stopping random thugs wouldn't work in getting him to Lincoln. He needed to find another way to get access to the son of a bitch. Grasping on the handle of the suitcase, Peter walked it over to his bed and unlatched the clasps holding it shut. He opened the top and began sorting through all the items, throwing the clothes into a nearby laundry basket and sorting through the toiletry items as he went. What if he tried to track down Hammerhead? He'd know where Lincoln was, right? Well, assuming the man was even out of the hospital yet from the beatdown that Peter had given to him last time. Broken ribs were no joke. Peter's had that injury a few times, and if it weren't for his accelerated healing, he knew that he would have been in a tough spot for quite a bit of time. What if? His train of thought immediately skidded to a halt. Because in his hand, grabbed absent-mindedly before he even registered what it was EDITH. There was a buzz in his brain as he could only gape at the pair of glasses that he had fought so hard to reobtain from Quentin. I'm a motherfucking narcissist back. Why hadn't he thought of this before? Was he really that Mary Jane obsessed that he had completely forgotten about this high-tech device that could track down nearly anything that he asked for? Without even wasting a beat, Peter unfolded the glasses and slid them up his nose. EDITH? Hello, Peter, the warm robotic voice greeted him. What can I do for you tonight? Hi, Peter broke off, twisting his lips, and he contemplated what exactly he should be asking. Are you able to track down a L. Thompson Lincoln? Stand by as I run the protocol. Immediately, on the screen before him, the lenses brought up a picture of the sorry excuse of a man as Lincoln's face popped up. Peter recognized the grayish pallor to the man's skin and hair. He almost looked like a walking corpse, the nickname Tombstone taking on a whole new meaning, and it left Peter wondering exactly how Lincoln had managed to convince the world that he was a good man. An angry red X appeared over the top of Lincoln's picture. I apologize, Peter. There hasn't been a trace of L. Thompson Lincoln since a little over a week ago. Peter let out a regretful sigh. The night that I posted that Instagram video threatening him and the others. Pacing the length of his room now, Peter stroked his chin in thought. Before it suddenly hit him. What about a Walter Hardy? Peter asked, stopping his pacing as he whirled to face the window. Please stand by. Before him, on the lenses, a picture of a middle-aged man with snow-white hair appeared on the screen. He had sharp features, with small narrowed eyes and a smirk of a smile. He looked like the sort of man who would be a former criminal, one who was up to no good. Waiting on bated breath, Peter anxiously shifted his weight from foot to foot. According to Ms. Grant, Kingpin, the Green Goblin, and Lincoln were all going after this guy. If Peter could get to him first, he could not only lend the man a level of protection, but he could possibly also use him to draw all three crime bosses out of the holes that they were hiding in. From there, it would be a good old-fashioned fight, where the victor would end up on top. The only concern that Peter had was having to face the Green Goblin again. If he were being honest with himself, he was still slightly traumatized from his last encounter with the madman. His bloody, deranged smile and manic laughter still haunted Peter's dreams. Shivering, Peter forced the thought from his mind. In all honesty, the perfect cure for his trauma and fear would be to face the goblin again and defeat him this time. A red X appeared over Walter Hardy's picture and Peter had to catch himself from swearing aloud in an escalated volume, at the last second aware of Aunt May sleeping in the other room. If I may, Peter, EDITH suddenly spoke up, causing a natural reaction of Peter's head jerking upward as he listened. I may not have been able to locate Walter Hardy. But he has a wife, Lydia Hardy, who is currently asleep in her home on Staten Island. Blinking, a slow smile crept over Peter's lips. He may have not found the man himself. But his wife? She had to know something of her husband's whereabouts, or at least know how to get into contact with him so that Peter could track him down. Tomorrow. He would show up at the Hardy residence tomorrow. Until then, he could finally get some sleep. Revealing more and more of the plot little by little. Please leave me a comment below.